Hello there. Today I'd like to take a look at an old Bordeaux. The wine I have here is a 1996 vintage of Chateau Fontenil. And Chateau Fontenil is a Fronsac. And I thought it would be good to look at this because at the end of March this year, a hugely important figure in Bordeaux's winemaking passed away. And that was the owner of this property, Michel Rolland. And Michel Rolland was an oenologist and international wine consultant, and he died of a heart attack towards the end of March this year. But in the preceding 50 years, Rolland had been a huge influence both on the style and the quality of the wines of Bordeaux, and beyond that, his influence spread around the world to many other regions internationally, and he has undeniably been a massive influence on wine styles and wine quality. Michel grew up in Pomerol. He was born in the auspicious 1947 vintage and grew up at Chateau Le Bon Pasteur. In the late 1960s, he met Dany, who went on to become his wife, and they married in 1970, and the pair of them qualified as oenologists at Bordeaux University in 1971. Initially, the company ran a laboratory in Le Bon, which they then actually went on to buy, and in 1976 renamed Laboritroie Rolland. At that stage, they were offering laboratory analysis services to winemakers throughout the Bordeaux region. Now, as well as owning Chateau Fontenil, Michel actually, prior to that, inherited the running of his family estates from his father when his father passed in 1979. Those estates being the aforementioned Chateau Bon Pasteur, there's a Saint-Emilion property, Rollin-Maillet, and a Lalande de Pomerol, Chateau Berthineau Saint-Vincent. Also in 1992, they leased a property in Lussac, Saint-Emilion, called Chateau La Grande Clotte. Now, the experience of running these estates enabled Michel to start offering a broader service than simply laboratory analysis. And his model quickly developed into that of being a consultant winemaker, a genre of which he was probably one of the earliest pioneers. And at this stage, in the early 1980s, there were a small group of wine consultants who set about revolutionising the quality of Bordeaux's winemaking. In 1985, Michel received an invitation to go to California and to consult for a producer there. And this engagement set him on the course of becoming one of the world's most influential international wine consultants, ending up with over 150 customers in 12 countries across 4 continents. So clearly outside Bordeaux as well, Rolland has had a huge influence. He's viewed as having been an important factor in the popularization of Argentine Malbec, for instance, having established the Clos d'Essert cooperative venture and his own Bodegas Rolland in the Unco Valley near Mendoza. Rolland also had a huge influence on the style of California's Cabernet Sauvignons, consulting to some of the top producers right up until the stage of his death. With the Lurton brothers, the Rollands developed a joint venture in Spain, in the Toro wine region, called Campo Elicio. And Michel Rolland has been a controversial figure. He was very much seen as a figure who was over-technical in his winemaking and being part of an influence of making all wines taste similar. He was also closely associated with the idea of making wines to optimize the scores gained from critics such as Robert Parker and James Suckling. While undoubtedly there may well be truth in the fact that many of the wines he made did get good scores from international wine critics, I think it's also important to recognise the improvement in quality that the Bordeaux region saw during the period of Rolland's greatest influence there. While it's possible not to like the style of wine that Rolland seemed to champion, with relatively high alcohol, ripe fruit and plentiful new oak, it should also be remembered that many of the wines that this style of wine replaced may not have been particularly high quality wines, and certainly lacked consistency of style and quality from vintage to vintage. So to talk about Chateau Fontenil itself, evidently in 1986, Michel and Dany Rolland were looking for a home. They were living in a flat above the laboratory where they worked, and they wanted to get out of the town of Liban into the countryside for a quieter life. They went to view a dilapidated old house in the commune of Cellars, which sits within the Fronsac appellation, just to the west of Liban. The house was on the top of a hill with beautiful views, but it was in a really dilapidated condition. However, it was surrounded by 7 hectares of vines, which were also for sale. These belonged to a property called Chateau Fontenil, and these vines included plots such as Filet Rouge and Chateau Fontenil, which both contained vines that had been planted prior to the 1950s. In fact, the records were such that their age was unknown. Other vines had been replanted following the 1956 frosts. So having gone to look at a house, they'd actually found some vines that really interested them. And thus the whole project became less about discovering a residence and more of a winemaking enterprise. Quite surprisingly, at the time that they came to sign off on buying the house, the vendor actually pulled out at the last minute, but they still bought the vines, relying on a verbal agreement that subsequently they'd be allowed to buy the house. And that purchase was something that finally eventuated in 1990. This was a completely new property, as the vines were only a portion of the La Forêt Oenology estate, and thus the name Fontenil, meaning a small fountain, was chosen, slightly echoing the name of the plot Chateau Fontenil. As soon as they purchased the estate, the couple soon set about improving the vineyards and the cellars, and then once they were able to, renovating the house, which they finally moved into in December 1997, with all the renovations on the buildings being completed by 1999. Now, the vines here lie on the highest part of the Fronsac plateau. The best parcels, such as Filet Rouge, which I've already mentioned, is south-facing, overlooking the town of Liban and the Ile River, which is a tributary of the Dordogne. And other plots, such as Carles, Les Forêts and Les Basques, have more of a northeasterly orientation. Now, the soil types vary quite vastly. At the top of the plateau, the hilltop has an underlying striated limestone. Now, a striated limestone is a limestone that's quite high in maritime fossils, so starfish, oyster shells, that sort of thing, and tends to be quite soft limestone that has really good water holding potential. The soils go down the hill through limestone terraces with clays, marls and sand, with increasing amounts of sand and clay on the lower slopes at the bottom of the hill. Now, I've touched on vine age already, but most of the vines are well over 40 years of age, giving the potential of producing good concentrated fruit. Today, the estate comprises 11.6 hectares in total, of which at least 9 are planted with Merlot. In 1996, when this wine was made, there were only the original 7 hectares of vines, and 10% of those were planted to Cabernet Sauvignon. Today, and since 2015, Cabernet has been uprooted and the wine is a pure Merlot. Currently, however, they do have a hectare planted with white grape varieties, so classically Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, Sauvignon Gris, Muscadel, and a small portion of Chardonnay. So they make a white wine that's labelled as a Vin de France. Annual production of Chateau Fontenil is in the region of 3,500 cases a year, although they do also make 300 cases of a wine that's called Le Defi de Fontenil, the Defiance of Fontenil, which was very much as an experimental cuvee first created by Michel Rolland in 1999 from one particular 1.6 hectare block of old Merlot vines. In 2000, 2001 and 2004, the Rollands came into conflict with the INAO for an experimental practice of using plastic sheeting between the vines to reduce the amount of rainfall reaching the soil. Evidently, the INAO saw this as too much of a modification of terroir. Those early vintages were simply labelled as a Vin de Table, and the wine has no longer been labelled at all as a Fronsac. They no longer use the plastic sheeting in the vineyards, but the wine today is labelled under the Vin de France label. Just to quickly touch on the 1996 vintage, A fresh spring had followed a mild winter. The flowering took place rapidly and consistently in a short period at the beginning of June in hot weather. The Rollands suggest that you'd have to go back either to 1986 or 1950 to the preceding times that they had seen conditions such as this. There had been storms at the end of August, but September saw the arrival of an anticyclone which sat over the region for 3 weeks, bringing hot, dry weather that promoted colour change in the grapes and ensured that tannins were fully ripened. Vintage began here on the 29th of September. The Merlot had lovely concentration and excellent varietal character, and the Cabernet Sauvignon achieved excellent ripeness. Yields here were 60 hectolitres per hectare, so that's pretty fair yields. I think it's important to realise that Chateau Fontenil had been one of the places where Michel Rolland had been using the techniques he was suggesting to other people. So in 1990, green harvesting had been tentatively employed here for the first time. So removing a portion of the crop during the growing season to ensure the remaining bunches on the vines gained greater ripeness. Handpicking was practiced and the fruit was picked into shallow crates to ensure that it wasn't damaged on its way to the winery by the weight of other grapes lying on top of it, pressing it and breaking the skins. Now in 1993 and 1994, the cellars here had been reconstructed and there was a lot of work needed doing on these old buildings. Evidently they were beautiful stone building, but there were termites in the roof. In fact, in 1995, the building next door had had its roof collapse as the termites had destroyed its structural integrity. Now, careful selection has been employed at Chateau Fontenil, with the fruit being sorted twice on sorting tables. First of all, as bunches when it first arrived, then as individual berries once it's been destemmed. So any fruit that was unripe, overripe or damaged could be discarded at this stage. The different vineyard plots are each vinified individually and kept separate up until the blending stage of the process. Fermentation took place in small wooden vats and stainless steel tanks, with the fruit in the wooden vats being pushed down to give gentle extraction and a very gentle pump over being done in the stainless steel tanks. The approach to maceration is to have a long but gentle maceration. Evidently, there have been vintages where this has gone on for 40 days. Malolactic fermentation and maturation both took place in French oak barrels, presumably 225-litre barriques, and of those, between 50 and 60% were new. And the wine matured in barrel for between 15 and 18 months prior to release. So let's take a look at it, shall we? Looking at the colour, this has a medium depth of, perhaps it's got a ruby core, but actually it's quite garnet at the rim. It's quite a vibrant colour. It's not looking tired, but it's not got that sort of depth and intensity of colour. The wine is 13% alcohol. It's not really forming obvious tears on the glass particularly readily. I assume it probably will eventually, but it's lost a lot of its density. Its tannins will have combined and some of those will have dropped out. So let's see what I make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are quite intense. Obviously, they're fully mature. There are notes of mushroom. There are notes of umami, truffle, those sort of rich, developed notes. There's perhaps some cedriness behind that. But there's also quite a lively red fruit note. I'm saying red fruit, almost sort of blood orange with hints of cranberry or something like that. Really quite high-toned. The orangey note is quite noticeable. Quite fresh, quite exciting. So let's have a taste, shall we? On the palate, there is a sort of a dustiness initially. It's like earthiness, quite typical of the sort of developed Merlots of regions such as Fronsac or Pomerol or Lalande de Pomerol. Now, sitting behind that, there's good acidity. That's where you're starting to see that sort of blood orange note really coming through as a freshness. maybe some hints of cranberry alongside it. There are cedary notes with integrated vanilla touches. And there is a very fine, drying, tannic grip, that sort of dustiness that I was talking about earlier. It's really fascinating how long those lovely sort of blood orange notes are lasting. The wine is light to medium bodied. It's lost most of its structure. Its alcohol at 13% is not huge. It's not intruding on this. The wine's acidity is helping to keep the fruit fits remaining quite fresh, and it's giving it a long, clean finish. Those notes of blood orange, maybe with a hint of bergamot and cedary touches, are lasting really well. There's not a great complexity to the wine, and I do suspect it would have offered much more interest had it have been drunk 5 or 10 years ago. But actually, incredibly, for what is not a particularly expensive wine, this wine still shows itself to be cleanly made, balanced, fresh, lively and interesting. It's very difficult to put a score on a wine of this age. I note that the winesearcher aggregated critic scores, put together from critic scores at the time the wine would have been released, is 88 out of 100. I think maybe if you can drink a wine like this after 30 years and still find it enjoyable, 88 is perhaps a score that's slightly underrated it. I would think this is a wine that's worth 90 or 91 points out of 100 at least. And it's a wine that I'm very much going to enjoy finishing off. I know Michel Rolland was a contentious figure in the wine world, but when I taste a wine like this, from what is quite a simple appellation, and find that it has been so well made that it will age for 30 years. I do think that maybe Rolland's main contribution to Bordeaux's winemaking has been the improvement in the quality of wines throughout the appellations, not just at the very top, but in regions like Fronsac, where Michel and Dany Rolland have very clearly shown that it's possible to consistently make exciting and interesting wines. So yes, it was very sad to hear of Michel Rolland's passing, but I think his influence will continue to be seen in Bordeaux for several generations to come. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, it would be great if you could press the like button. I'd really appreciate that. If you have any friends you think might like to watch, do please feel free to pass it on to them. That would be a great endorsement. I'd really appreciate that coming from you. If you have any comments or questions, please do pop those in the comments box. It would be great to hear what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to the subject. I will, of course, leave a link to the winesearcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, and from there you'll be able to look at other vintages as well. I'm not sure there's a lot of the 96 left available in the market, although it is still available to buy. And I think you'll find it can be at quite reasonable prices as well. So thank you again for joining me, and I hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me for another tasting at some stage in the near future. Until then, bye for now.